What if you could get really good grief support for just $3 a month? If you're navigating life after loss but are a little tight in the money department, consider becoming a patron of Coming Back on Patreon. Listeners who support this podcast on Patreon receive weekly grief journaling prompts released every Monday morning and a once-a-month private grief hangout with me. If you're looking for an easy, inexpensive way to stay in touch with your grief, become a patron now at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Your monthly pledge helps me keep this podcast on the air and allows me to produce online courses, books, and very special grief experiences for grievers just like you. Get started now at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Thank you so much for listening. Hi there, and welcome to Coming Back, a podcast about coming back to life after death, divorce, diagnosis, and more. Today, I'm speaking with comedian, nurse, and ex-nun Kelli Dunham, who had 2 partners die in her arms in the course of just 5 years. Today, we're talking about the role of storytelling and humor in grief, why finding meaning for a loss doesn't make grief magically vanish, and what it's like to have a partner choose to die by medically assisted death. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who speaks, writes, and teaches powerful truths on grief and loss. My mom's death in 2013 set me on the path to becoming a lifelong student of grief, and I use what I learned to create a world where grief is welcomed, normalized, and even embraced. Because even through grief, we are growing. Let's get started. Kelli Dunham is the genderqueer ex-nun storytelling nurse comic that's so common in modern Brooklyn. Kelli has appeared on Showtime and the Discovery Channel, the Moth main stage, and nationwide at colleges, prides, fundraisers, and even the occasional livestock auction. Kelli is the author of 7 hilarious nonfiction books about very not humorous subjects, including kids' guides to puberty, and recently helped set the Guinness World Record for the longest comedy show with multiple performers. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio once called Kelli a show-off, to her face. Kelli, I'm so radically delighted to have you on Coming Back with us today to talk about your life as a nun, a nurse, a queer person, and a grieving person. There are many intersections throughout your life that I think apply to grief because grief permeates everything. So if you could please start us off with your loss story.
The shorter version of it is in 2007, my partner of a few years, she had actually we met when she was in remission from ovarian cancer, and about 9 months into our relationship, she had like a very, very extensive recurrence. She got very quickly ill and then almost died, got better. We had a couple of years together, and then we were living in Oregon, and she used the Oregon physician-assisted suicide law to take her own life because she was just like, I am tired and done. And so I thought, I'll never love anyone like I loved Heather, and moved to New York. And 2 years later, I started dating somebody else. And again, it's true, I was not loving someone like Heather. She was very unlike Heather. But I fell in love again, and we dated for about 2.5 years, or about 2.5, 3 years into the relationship. And she thought that her primary care provider thought that she had developed adult onset asthma because she was having shortness of breath. And it turned out to be of course, in women, they always compare tumors to fruit, a cantaloupe size tumor in her chest secondary to Hodgkin's lymphoma. 85% of people who are diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma are considered completely cured with the standard chemotherapy. But 2% of people who get that chemotherapy, which is it's bleomycin is the central agent, die from bleomycin. It has a really strong pulmonary effect. And Cheryl developed a pulmonary reaction to the bleomycin, which was supposed to cure her. And she died after 3 months in the hospital. And I always say, like, when I talk about it, it's the second part of the story is sometimes harder for people. They're like, oh my God, like, I can't believe this story goes on. And I'll say like, yeah, the first time something terrible happens, you could be like, oh, I guess I was supposed to learn a lesson from that. But the second one just feels like one time I saw one of my other nephews, one nephew was just like, laying relaxed on the couch. And my little nephew just came up and punched him in the side of the head. And he was like, what was that for? I kind of felt like that about the second loss. Like, what was that for?
I totally hear you. In this back to back nature is like, holy whoa. Like I just got punched and then somebody came from around the corner and kicked me in the stomach. Like,
Right. Yeah.
the thing, I mean, and I want to touch on something you said, because you're like, the first loss happened and I thought maybe I was supposed to learn from that. And I wonder if that's something that you believe to be true, because I've seen a lot of narrative circulating lately about how trauma, loss, and death don't exist to teach us lessons. Like, if we learn them, great, but there's this societal belief that we're supposed to, quote unquote, get something or learn something or become better people because of the fact that loss happens, when I guess, in my own personal opinion, that's not always the case.
Well, yeah, it reminds me of I have a niece who was very severely injured in the earthquake in Haiti, and one time after she had moved here, we were listening to that song. I forget who sings it, though. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And she said, Aunt Kelly, do you think this is true? And I was like, I think you got to call that one. I don't think I'm supposed to tell you if I think this is true. I think like that's your call. And she thinks for a minute and she goes, no, I think it makes you weirder. And I was like, yeah, what doesn't kill you makes you weirder. I think that's actually probably a more perfect distillation. And also, it's like, for myself, I although especially in the beginning, I was just so angry, and actually in some ways I was less angry after the second loss because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, because I knew better how to treat myself and I didn't take care as much of the people around me, so I didn't have that kind of anger built up. And also because I felt like if I let myself be angry, that was all I was going to be. And I felt like that was not going to work long term. But for me, and this is like specifically for me, and I would hate it if somebody said this to me, and I never give this as advice to somebody else. But for me, finding meaning, right, in loss is kind of, and whether the meaning is just like, be nicer to the people around you or whatever the meaning is, it was helpful for me in healing. And almost if there wouldn't have even been a meeting, right? Like, I don't think, like, also it's not fair to my partner to be like, oh, well, sorry you died at 38, but I learned a good lesson from it. That seems kind of horrible.
Yeah.
So, but like whatever meaning I apply to it to kind of get through it, that's because that's like the way my brain is wired and the way I'm wired. Like, I'm a Midwesterner, like, hey, let's see if we can get a project out of this. That's how I heal. So,
I'm sitting in the Midwest right now cackling because that's so true. Let's see if we can make a little weekend project out of this. Just grab a hammer.
We can build a birdhouse. So I know that's how I heal, and I know that's how I've gotten through things in the past. And so, similarly, so I don't definitely, and I think that's just always such a horrible thing to say to people, because also it, then if somebody's like, there's still the loss, making meaning of it doesn't make it disappear, but it makes it more manageable, right? For me, it makes it more manageable.
I think that's a great response to that. And a lot of times on Coming Back, we talk about making room in our brains and in our hearts and in our lives for grief to belong. And making purpose helps grief, like, find a place where it fits, like you negotiate it into a cubby. And it's still just as big as it was on the day that they died, but like now you've made a file folder for it. And so it has somewhere to go. So I love that idea of like making meaning was helpful for me on my journey. I want to ask another question that I've heard from people who listen to this podcast who've had multiple back-to-back losses happen. And there's this sense of feeling cursed. So I wonder if this is like a story that you told yourself, or if even people joked about it with you, like, oh, you must be cursed, or like, nobody date Kelli because she'll probably die.
Oh, I do appreciate a close friend who can actually make that joke. I remember when I started dating again, I inherited my second partner's cat, which, her cat came to live with me, and nephew was like, that is the most lesbian inheritance ever, that the cat came to live with you. And when I first started dating again, Lulu was not Lulu the cat was not digging that. Like she'd meet the person at the bedroom door and just like be like, this terrible noise. And then like maybe 4 years after Cheryl died, I brought somebody home and she got Lulu's approval. And I remember one of my friends said, yeah, Kelli, I knew you had another relationship and I just didn't know if Lulu did, So I do definitely have had people, I always feel like a close friend who can actually joke about that. I really appreciate it. I did have a feeling kind of, because also the losses in some way were so similar, like both women died at 38. Both women died of cancer, and that's a pretty young age. And then also with Cheryl, where it's something where she had such a curable cancer, but instead of dying of the cancer, she died of the cure. I asked my friend who was an epidemiologist, I was like, could you figure out the likelihood of that? And she started, and she was like, you know what? I don't think that's going to be helpful for you to know. And there is a sense in which, especially because I have like kind of this extensive background as an evangelical Christian and also as a nun, like, okay, God, what are you trying to tell me? Even though I kind of have this also, like this relationship with God where I'm like, oh, that guy's my ex. I'm not, I always wanted to make it work, but, we could just it never quite did. So I already have that kind of like, I don't know, not even troubled, but like, intimate, but yet, sparring relationship to begin with. And, so it's almost in the sense of like, okay, that's one way to look at it is I'm cursed. That is one possibility. And I really think if I had been a straight woman, I think it would have been a lot harder to find another relationship. Like I have a tattoo, on my chest that has that was designed for me by Heather, my first partner I love. And it is filled in with her ashes, which seemed like a great idea at the time. And then later I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to have sex again, but I'm having sex with women. So like, they were just like, that was almost not even a turn off. That was something they were like, oh, that's so sweet. So I was like, oh, thank goodness, like that people are kind of like, emotionally attuned or don't mind that kind of like what other people might think is kind of morbid. So I feel very lucky in that way, that I didn't feel undateable, and that helped a lot in not feeling cursed, right? To feel like, I can have another relationship and, and also something very sweet that one of the guys from my first grief that I was involved in, after Cheryl died, he had been afraid to date again. And then he started dating me again. And he was like, you're the reason, like Cheryl's death is the reason why I'm dating again. And I was like, really? Why? That makes no sense. And he goes, because the very worst thing that we always worry about happening, which is to lose another person, happened to you and you're still standing. So I guess I can take that chance.
That's an interesting insight. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, I'm like, and yet you'll never really know what this is like. Like it's a comparative grief experience where he's like, I'm afraid to date, blah, blah, blah. And here you are having lost two partners in the past. How many years was it?
Yeah,
between the two?
It was like 5 years between Heather's death and Cheryl's death. So
yeah, in the course of 5 years, and he's like, now I'm feeling brave. So
right.
I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that,
right? Well,
but also fine. If you want to use my grief as motivation,
right.
You go right ahead.
Right, but he had also lost a partner, right? So in a way, it was
okay.
I was, but he lost a partner, but was afraid to date again, and then I started dating again and lost another partner, and he said like that everyone who loses a partner, that's what they're afraid of, right? Is losing the second person. That's why they're like, oh, I can't go through that grief again. But the thing is, you can, right? I mean, you can. You don't really have any. People are like, oh, I can't believe you're still standing. I'm like, well, what are the choices here? I'm a New Yorker. You can't just like lay down in the gutter and die. Stick,
Yeah, and that's just so well said, because that is the worst fear, is if I love again, if I risk again, if I get into another relationship, I'm going to lose them too. And you're like, well, I survived that. Do you feel invincible This is the opposite of the question. Do you feel cursed? But do you ever feel invincible now? You're like, I've survived the worst and then the second worst.
In some ways, kind of like I do feel, especially like after I kind of started to like reassemble my life, it did start to feel like, not invincibility, but it did start to feel like, the movie Forrest Gump. There's a scene where Captain Dan, who lost his legs he's the guy that Forrest Gump saved, and he lost his legs. And there's a scene where they're like in the sea, and he is up, and there's a huge storm, a hurricane, and Captain Dan is on top of the mast during a storm, and he's like waving up in the heaven. He's like, "Bring it on, bring it on. This is a showdown, you and me." And that's sometimes kind of how I felt like, yeah, bring it on, bring it on. I mean, then something terrible happens and I feel awful, but there is a sense in which, I do, and I have to say there is something that's a little lonely about it because, sometimes I don't want to hear about other people's stupid shit, I think there's a way in which I'm like, oh, am I turning into my father? That I'm like, no, everyone's just as happy as they make up their mind they're going to be, and I don't really feel that way. But like sometimes when I see people struggle with what to me looks like, like really like I saw somebody that I work with today, the thing that holds the condiments in the refrigerator, like the little metal thing came undone. And she was like, I can't believe this came undone. And in my head, I was thinking, I can't believe you think this is a big deal,
Yeah, totally.
Which is never happy or never healthy. Well, it's never helpful. I don't know whether it's healthy or not, but it's never helpful, right? Because, well, comparing losses or whatever, that's never helpful because even though once in a while perspective might be helpful, it never actually makes you feel better. If I ran into somebody who lost 4 partners, I don't think it would make me feel like, oh, well, thank God I've only lost 2, well, maybe it would because I am kind of Midwestern in that way, but I wouldn't want somebody to say it to me as a way to console me,
Sure. And I'll say, we talk a lot on this podcast about not comparing losses as like that's kind of a no-no. But I should add like an addendum to that. Don't compare losses out loud because God knows we're all doing it in our heads.
Right. Absolutely.
I have 3 different jobs and all kinds of stuff happens at all 3 of them. And there are people running around with their hair on fire. Like the whole thing's a crisis. And I'm just sitting in the middle of the room. I'm like, my mom's not dying. So like, this isn't that bad. And so, but it's all based on my personal scale of what I've been through. And so for them, I'm like, I'm sure this is like a DEFCON 5, whatever the highest number. I don't know what the highest number is. Whatever the DEFCON number is, that's terrible. I'm sure it's that level for them where I'm like sitting there. I'm like, we could figure this out. Like, it's not rocket science, it's not rocket science. It's not death. It's not, it's not that dire of a situation. But then I have to remember to put my feet on the ground and say, oh, this is a crisis for them, even if it's not for me. And respect how that's happening. But all this dialogue is happening. Yeah. Right inside my head.
Right. Yeah. And also because sometimes then that kind of cuts you off from compassion, like, and then that's no fun because then that does contribute to the loneliness, right? Like the kind of like, like, oh, you think that's a problem? That, I mean, there's going to inevitably be some of that. And I do feel like sometimes I have, especially people who have like a lot of privilege and they, yeah. So there was a guy sitting next to me in an airplane on the last flight I took a couple days ago. And it was like one of the flights with it had, anyway, basically he thought that I was encroaching on his space. What he does not know is that fat people are extremely aware on airplanes on whether or not we are encroaching on people's space. And I knew I was barely, if all, encroaching on his space because of the setup. And he was just so upset about it. And in my head, I was thinking, how hard is it to be such a huge crybaby that this is such a terrible thing for you? That this totally, like a 40-minute flight where somebody's shoulder brushed you is just like a tragedy. It almost makes you, like I did almost feel sorry for him because I was like, well, you seem more upset about that, than I was about having to have a knee replacement, like that there is a certain kind of tragedy in having no tragedy as well. So, and I have to remind myself of that sometimes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that, that compassion element goes missing when that happens.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
I just want to breathe in, breathe out, and acknowledge that that's a reality that all grievers live in at some point, especially we're recording this in November, but we're going into the holiday season, and there are so many things that could seem like a crisis in the holidays, like we burned the turkey, or we didn't pick up the gifts on layaway, or we forgot to order the screwdriver to put the dollhouse together, whatever. And I'm like, it's all I'm like, I'm still alive, aren't I? So,
Yeah.
am I still here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So everybody else still here. Yeah. So you kind of you run down the checklist in your head. I want to circle back to something you were talking about at the very beginning, with your first partner who died, Heather, and this process in Oregon of physician-assisted suicide. And this is
Mm-hmm.
something that I talked about on the very first full-length episode of Coming Back. There was an article, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal about a man from Canada who planned and orchestrated his own death and was present at his wake, and then died by medically assisted suicide like 2 or 3 days later with just family and friends. And the picture they painted of it was something that was so like, I got to be in charge of this, as opposed
Mm.
to, you know, my life was extended longer than I wanted it to be. I died in a hospital. I wasn't surrounded by family. Like all these things that happen that add additional pain or layers of pain onto grief. And so I'm wondering what your experience of that was like as her partner.
Well, I always say, assisted suicide would not have been my choice, but it wasn't my choice to make. And I do have, there's very complicated, there's a lot of worries about it being available, right? Like if insurance companies could suggest that we kill ourselves instead of having expensive treatment, that would be their recommendation always, right? So, and people with disabilities have a very real fear of somebody else assigning like, oh, well, that's not a life worth living. So I just want to say, it's very important. Like I would never want to talk about it without saying there's extremely scary political stuff, including some political nuances. That makes me, that there is no way, I'm not a person, on the sidelines with everyone needs assisted suicide. So that's, my caveat. For Heather, when we went she had told me when we were originally in a long distance relationship, and she said, like, this isn't a great time to be alive. If you want to be in a relationship with me, you might want to move because it's a bad time to be in long distance. And it was terrible. And so before I did that, she said, if things get as bad as they were, she had like this unremitting nausea for like 10 weeks. And she's like, if it gets bad like that again, I'm going to try and, figure out a legal way to do this. And I think it's only fair that if you are going to come and we are going to be together, that you don't have to be necessarily super on board, but I need you to not oppose it. And I said yes, because, you say yes to when somebody's dying. And when we went to talk with the assisted suicide liaison, when it seemed like it was getting that point, there's like a special person that you go and talk to. It was at the hospital where Heather was getting chemo. And she started with saying, well, now this is not a choice for everyone. This is a choice for somebody who really wants to take charge. And then all of us, there's like 7 of us, her friends and me and, another person. And we're all like, oh, like just, almost like crumple up a paper and toss it over our backs, because that was exactly, I called her my queen. Like she was the boss and that was the arrangement, and, so it was very much that. And I do feel like it did give her, it gave her the ability to take back some control. So, it doesn't make dying at 38 any better, but it made it less prolonged. And also, what is often the way when somebody gets sick and then gets better again and then gets sick and then better, there kind of ends up being an extremely protracted series of goodbyes, which often isn't that fun for the dying person. Like everyone wants to say goodbye, but they're like, I've already said goodbye 4 times. And having an actual idea of when the actual end is going to come in some ways was very helpful. Like Like I emailed all her friends and asked them to like put out a 1-word description of her. And then all her, she had like an email list, like kind of before the lots of helping hands or whatever. And so everyone sent like beautiful stuff to her, and I got it to read it to her out loud. And we all spent a day together. It's kind of this very, wild scene of like all of us. We lived in a converted Hare Krishna temple in Portland, not really very converted, but and like all her friends were there dressed in like full leather and like, like very, like just kind of celebrating her in the way she would want to be celebrated. And so that there was something very beautiful and terrible about that day. It was exactly the right send off for her. Also, it was terrible. Everything about it was terrible. I wish that, the person who I didn't do the negotiation for the actual, like picking up the stuff at the pharmacy, but stirring the stuff into the like chocolate pudding was terrible. The process was terrible. There was nothing about it. I still felt like, oh, maybe that wasn't quick enough. Did we do it wrong? We didn't know if it was going to work at first. It was terrible, but it was exactly what she wanted. So in that way, it felt like a gift to her.
Thank you for going into so much detail there, because that's a host of perspectives that I had never heard before on assisted suicide. Because basically, what exists right now is what news outlets decide to write about it. There's not a lot of
Right.
people who are out here telling these stories. And I'm thinking with the chocolate pudding, this developed into a routine of yours, did it not?
Yeah, I have a show that I actually wrote it very shortly after she died, like within a year. It was called Pudding Day. It was like a 1-person show, like a 15-minute show, mostly about kind of like our romance, which started, so quickly. Like she was sick at the very beginning of our relationship. So it's interesting to have new relationship energy and also the person's dying, right? Like that's kind of an interesting thing. And it was kind of beautiful. And it seemed like, you know, it was very beautiful. It felt like a gift to each other, and there was something very kind of wild and romantic about it in that way, and horrible. And so writing about that, and then also kind of the last days, and she was extremely frank about her death. Like I talk about how, a couple of weeks before she died, I called her and I said, I'm at the grocery store. Do you need anything? And she said, yeah, how about a quarter pound of the will to live? And I was like, oh, okay, she's going to go there. And I said, well, honey, you know how it is. I'm at Trader Joe's and they only had organic and now they're out. And she said, oh, God damn, I had a coupon too. And that we were able to talk that frankly about death. And I actually do a presentation at, inevitably it's the LGBT group that brings me in. And then the presentation is called Laughter at the End of Life. And it's kind of talking about like both some of the research that has been done about kind of quote unquote gallows humor. And then also some of kind of these personal stories and what we learned from it and stuff. And inevitably it's the LGBT employees group that brings me to a hospital or a nursing school or something like that. And then all the social workers and all the hospice people come because all their clients are using humor and they've just never been taught how to handle it, So that's been one kind of the interesting thing. And I think that's something that Heather would be very proud of, that she would love being talked about 11 years later for being, fierce. But yeah, so that ended up, I have to say that was 2008. So whatever, 11 years ago. Really nobody wanted to hear that story 11 years ago. I think if I decided I wanted to tour that show now, I think people would be more interested in having those conversations. But that was not a show anyone was biting on then. So, and I do a lot of performance around. I have a whole. I'm actually working on a Lego video to go with it, which is like my kind of send up of widow camp. Comparing it to like summer camp. So there is a lot that kind of got, I don't know, inserted into comedy and storytelling for sure.
So what's changed in 11 years where this story has become something that people want to receive or sit down for or bring into their workplaces?
Well, I think specifically assisted suicide, it's, there are more states that have considered have either passed legislation or considered it. It's more part of the public conversation. Brittany Maynard was very instrumental in kind of having like a very mainstream discussion about it. I do think the aging of baby boomers is helping because people are thinking about end of life, and there's just like a very large group of people thinking about end of life, and they're powerful. So I think that helps. And I think one of the things is when we talk about assisted suicide, like Heather used assisted suicide to end her life, and it was very, I don't know if it was peaceful, but it was, it was the way she wanted to go. And Cheryl died in the ICU at a large, medical center. But she did not, and she did not have a death that was, some of the deaths we most fear, where you're being held, kept alive by machines, kind of when you don't want to be, and they're doing CPR on somebody who is never going to actually regain consciousness, kind of that kind of thing. Because we had safeguards in place to make sure that wasn't, right? Like Heather died in my arms, Cheryl died in my arms, peacefully as somebody can go, right? At 38 years old, especially. So I think one of the things is that physician-assisted suicide is kind of almost like a symptom. The need for it is a symptom, partly because we haven't talked enough about end-of-life stuff, and people don't know all the options that there are and don't understand what the options mean, I mean, there are some extreme cases, like one of the most common things is ALS. That's one of the most common reasons people are complete the physician-assisted suicide. And that something can be a very protracted thing, and people feel very, there's also some like discomfort. And so there's that specific kind of scenario. But like, as far as, that's not the most common scenario. And in fact, I don't know what the stats are right now, but the year that Heather used in 2007, there's like maybe 200 people in Oregon who made the application. 190 people got approved. Like maybe 75% of those people picked up the medication, and only like half of those used it. So for a lot of people, just knowing that they have an out is actually a very, very helpful thing, that people know they're not going to get to a place where they're completely ready to be done and they're really suffering and they can't, and they have to just suffer,
And for grief growers tuning into this who have never heard of medically assisted suicide before, or like it's a vague idea, know that where it is legal, there are laws regarding how you obtain these medications. And one of the biggest ones is you must agree to stop all preventative care. It's very similar to like entering hospice. So it's not a thing where you can sign up to die and then they'll just give you the drugs. You have to go through a whole rigmarole of paperwork and yeah, all these things to obtain the, do I want to say the privilege, the medication to die. And I think this is really important. I wrote down as you were speaking, because I was thinking about you having these two partners who died both at 38, both from the same thing, and this notion of, am I cursed? I keep marrying people that die. And then I wrote down, we're all in a relationship with a dying person.
Yeah.
We just don't know when.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And also the other thing that, I do realize it's a huge privilege that there are people who go their whole lives and are never seen it or loved the way that I was loved by Heather, or the very different way that I was loved by Cheryl, right? Like, I know that is many people live without that their whole life. So, and also like many LGBT people maybe 100 years ago would never even have the ability to live an out life like that, where it was acknowledged, and that the loss was even acknowledged. So I understand the privilege of that. And, even now, now I'm in another lovely, like beautiful, different, of course, than them relationship. And to have three people, and I believe like, there's lots of different ways to love, and people have all sorts of kind of different ways of experiencing love. But in that specific way, I feel I mean, I feel lucky,
Can we take a moment to just dive into the role of humor in grief? Because I think a lot of people are afraid to make jokes
Mm,
because for fear of being seen as inappropriate or not respectful of what's happening. And then other people jump right to making
mm.
jokes or like gallows humor because they're like, this is how I cope. And I feel like I saw this on your website, but something I read in relation to you was comedy equals tragedy plus time. So I'm wondering kind of how you construct humor or even have an identity of being funny after so many awful things have happened in your life.
Well, yeah, I think the comedy is tragedy plus time. I think Carol Burnett said that, but it might be somebody else. But the follow up that I say, like when I first started doing my thing about, my piece about widow camp, um, one of the things I'd say is I'd try and get some audience buy-in, right? Because if you're going to joke about your dead partners, you want people to, you almost want to invite them to ask for it. Like, hey, you guys ready to hear a joke about my dead partners? Yeah? Okay. That kind of thing. But I would say like, you know, um, humor is, or comedy is tragedy plus time. My tragedy, I decide how much time. So that, gets people to remember, okay, if you're laughing about it. And sometimes it's a little harder um, if an audience can't laugh at somebody they feel pity for. That's kind of not a hearty laugh. There can be a little pity laugh,
Mm.
but if they're feeling pity, so one of the things is the audience has to feel that I am okay. And I think right after, I mean, one thing is 11 years ago when Heather died, and I'd only been performing comedy like 5 or 6 years. Now I've been at it for a long time, and I have more confidence. So I am able to better portray I am okay. Also, I believe I am okay in a way I didn't. Like after Heather died, I was like, oh, I wonder if you can just break from this. Like, am I just going to crumble into pieces? So I have more confidence. Even after Cheryl died, I was like, uh, you know, I mean, in a way it was terrible. Like when my friend came to, I signed the DNR and, I just finished the signature and she said, uh, and I said, yeah, the problem is not even right now. The problem is I know what tomorrow feels like, because I'd already, the morning when you wake up and the person's not beside you, I already knew what that felt like. But I also knew that it was possible to survive it. And that is something that is very helpful, to know, well, I did live through this before, and these are the things that worked and these are the things that made it worse. And I didn't have a lot of tolerance for people. You lose friends in grief. You lose friends. There's no, that just happens. Some people disappear, and people you never thought could hang with you do. And I've just come to accept that that's part of it, and that's part of the tragedy in some ways, but it just is. The idea that grief is a language, and if you don't speak it, you just don't speak it. So, uh, anyway, so I think once I had the confidence that I knew that I was going to be okay, um, okay with maybe a small O, I think that helped people more be able to laugh about it on stage. Um, with Heather, it certainly helped that she was very funny. And then I'll say like, well, humor, like gallows humor around death and stuff is you have to kind of follow the lead of the person who's most impacted by it. So you can, use a baseball analogy, queer. I'm a queer person. I use a baseball analogy. Like, the person who is suffering most gets to throw the ball, and then you get to catch it, but you don't throw it back any harder than it was thrown at you,
Oh, I like that. That's visual.
Yeah. So helps people understand, like, oh, because often I remember sitting with Cheryl at chemo at Beth Israel, and it's New York, so of course the person next door is some famous opera singer, and so the person was saying, and how in chemo suites you're like lined up like a bunch of cows, ready for milking, and so it's all open, and so the guy was saying, this doesn't work. What I'm hoping is that I'm just going to drop dead on stage. He's like, It's going to be terrible for the audience, but awesome for me. He was joking around, which is such a New Yorker thing to say as well. And the nurses came over and shushed him, right? And I understand partly why they shushed him. It was partly because they were worried about the other patients being uncomfortable, like maybe the patients who didn't have a diagnosis where they could die or they were likely to die, or I don't know. But really, the people who were most uncomfortable, and I say this as a nurse and having a great compassion for healthcare providers, they were the ones who were really uncomfortable. They shushed him for them, And I felt like, yeah, because nobody taught them. Nobody taught them that, you could joke around with the patient, or you could even say like, whoa, you think everyone wants to hear that? Or, like there's 1,000 ways besides shushing, that you might, and also maybe that was the only way he was going to talk about death, right? Maybe that was the only way that, 65-year-old that man of a certain era or a certain age was going to be able to talk about his feelings about death. And then you just shut that down, or they just shut that down.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I literally just wrote down this question for you of as a nurse, as someone who has both been a partner to and a companion to people who are dying, and as somebody who just is around a lot of hard things being in the comedy world, what's like the number one thing that you wish people who did not have your perspective knew? Like if you could just infuse their brains with like, here's some knowledge, and now I wish everyone knew this, what would that be?
I mean, I don't know. One thing I think that is important that people know is that listening or being present is doing something. Not running away is doing something. My mom and I had kind of she's a very, fervent evangelical Christian. And so when I came out, it was not easy, for her, and it was not easy for our relationship. But, Heather died in 2007 and her husband died, into like the end of that year. And I just sat with her afterwards. We didn't talk. We didn't even watch TV. We just sat. And that like just gave a gift to our relationship that's completely changed and made it, I mean, it's kind of like we're peers in some ways, right? And my mom always says like, oh, that was just such a gift. That was just such a gift. I didn't know what else to do. So that's why I did. And I hated it when people like kind of forced things on me, in the early stages, especially. But especially, she's like a Midwestern lady of a certain age. So the idea that somebody would just sit with her, felt very, I want to say almost strange, but like sometimes the best thing you can do for somebody is to not disappear, and the kind of corollary of that, sometimes people who are grieving, especially in the early stages, just want who they want around. And sometimes it's personal, but oftentimes it's not. It's just you need the person that you have easiest access to, or the person who doesn't worry so much about food, or the person, like you need who's the person. You need the consolation from the person you need consolation from, and sometimes that isn't going to be the person who maybe would like to be there. And that's really, really hard for people. I had circumstances with that, and I realized that it's a terrible rejection. But also, in the same way that being present for somebody is a gift, going the hell away when someone needs you to go away, checking in, putting in your calendar 6 months later, call this person, giving somebody a little space when they specifically requested it, that also can be a beautiful, beautiful gift.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's this weird kind of nonverbal dance of I want you, but I don't want you. And so
Mm-hmm.
if non-grieving people could just understand the weird pressure of living in that space of like, I want comfort, but only from these specific people, and maybe not today, maybe in like 2 weeks. It's such an
or 20 minutes.
Or 20 minutes. We never we don't operate this way in like the quote unquote normal world. I'm thinking of like in our workplaces or even with our intimate partners or with our kids, we're like, no, we're leaving for the park in 15 minutes and all of us are going. Like that's how we schedule our lives. And it's not so emotionally curated. And so I love that that would be like, here's the one thing I need to inject into everybody's brains because they need to understand like what that feels like because it's such a specific experience to want comfort from certain people in certain pockets of time and then to want others to go away. And then, in the next minute or the next hour to want everyone to show up again. It's such,
Right.
and nobody's really giving language to that. So thank you for saying that. Kelli, this has just been so much fun. I would love if you could let people know where they can find you and your work, including all of your comedy stuff and anything else you'd like to share.
Well, I'm everywhere on social. Well, not everywhere, but Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Kelli Dunham. So that's Kelli, just an I, like a cheerleader, Dunham. And then my website is kellydunham.com. I have a CD. It will be or has been released February 7th, 2020. It's called Not the Gym Teacher. And there is quite a bit of grief and loss stuff on there for you grief comedy aficionados. And also something I'm doing as touring part of the CD, I'm doing house concerts, and I'm doing house concerts for causes that are important to people. So if you would like a comedy house concert, especially if you're within easy traveling of the Northeast, although I'm going to be in Ohio and Texas and Florida, and we'll make other considerations if I can make shows work in other areas, I'd love to do a free house concert. All you got to do is invite your friends. I'll come be funny. You can pass the hat for whatever, good cause you want to. It's a way of me sharing the comedy and promoting the CD, and then also making good things happen in the world. So, and even if you don't think you can make a comedy house concert, I have a whole, PDF on each step to take. And really, it's just you inviting your friends over to your house and them laughing, which is pretty amazing.
That's really cool and kind of goes back to these old school ideas of gather around the fire and do storytelling together. But then the perk on top of it is that there's money going to a charity or a good cause or somebody who really needs it. So that's really phenomenal. Kelli, thank you so much for sharing space with me today. This was a blast.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad we had this conversation.
So that's all for this episode of Coming Back. Thank you so much to Kelli Dunham for joining me for a serious and silly conversation on life after loss. You can find Kelli's work and her latest CD, Not the Gym Teacher, at kellydunham.com. There you can also ask Kelli to put on a house show for you and your friends, while she'll come over and entertain you and a group of your loved ones for a very good cause. And of course, you can find that link to Kelli's website in the show notes. If you'd like to get online grief support for just $3 a month, pledge to support this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. You'll instantly unlock access to weekly grief journaling prompts and monthly live calls with me. A quick reminder that our next live grief support call is happening soon on Monday, March 30th at 7 p.m. Central Time. No fancy software needed. You'll get the link to join the call the morning of the call. A huge and tremendous thank you this week to Lori, Maya, Laura, and Pauline, who just pledged to support Coming Back on Patreon. I am so grateful for you. If you liked what you heard today, subscribe to Coming Back on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and tell a friend about Coming Back, because you never know what someone you love is going through. Thank you so much to Addie Goldstein, who composed our theme music. You can find me on Facebook at Shelby Forsythia Intuitive Grief Guide, Instagram at Shelby Forsythia, or simply shelbyforsythia.com. If you'd like to leave a question or comment for a future show, email me at shelby@shelbyforsythia.com. As always, my dear grief growers, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you, I'm proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world, and I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing. There are a lot of books about how grief changes us, but what about how grief changes our friendships? I'm working on a new book right now about how grief impacts our closest, longest, and most intimate relationships with others. If you'd like to share a story about how grief has changed your friendship, made it more awkward, or ended it entirely, please head to shelbyforsythia.com/friends to fill out a submission form. You might just have your story published in my next book all about grief and friendships. Once again, that link is shelbyforsythia.com/friends with an S. Thank you so very much in advance for allowing me to read, witness, and learn from your stories on grief and friendship.